Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Intergenerational Solidarity Series, a podcast brought to you by Civic Voice, Inuka Kenya Nisisi, and The Elephant. I'm Darius Okola here with episode 8 about a national dissent now known as the Gen Z Revolution. And joining me to discuss this is Professor Nzomo. Professor Nzomo is a prominent scholar and a professor of international relations and governance director at the Diplomacy Institute. Karibu sana, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Professor, just getting started, there is this claim that our politics has been, in a sense, supremacist, in a sense, old guard and dynastic in terms of its orientation, and has not been necessarily representative. Is there credence, is there credibility to that claim? And how has that played out in the last, let's say, 4 decades?
That's a good question. I would say yes and no. Yes, to some extent, the so-called old guard dynasties, the proper lack of representation in its real sense has been played out over the years. You have talked about 4 decades. I think that has been the case. But I think we also need to look at another angle to that. Because sometimes when you talk about the old guard and dynasties, that may be a bit too much of a generalization. Because if you go back to way back at the time of independence, in the 1963 and that whole decade and the next one, and even coming up to upwards, you see that the age group was more or less the way we are seeing now, but not in terms of having old guard entirely. Let me put it differently. The Kenyatta government, Jomo Kenyatta, he was the oldest, the ex-president in his government. He was 63 when he took over power. In his government, he had people who held very senior positions who were quite young. People like Tom Mboya. Tom Mboya, at the time he was assassinated in the streets of Nairobi. He was around 30, 33, thereabouts. And there were others like him, quite young. And if you look at a chronology coming up and look at the average age, it has always been around 40, between 40 and 60. And the majority would not be in the 60s, they'll be younger. So the age, I would say, it has not varied that much, yeah, in terms of age, if you are just talking age. What has happened over time is that those who used to be then there as young Turks have remained in power. They have not left, many of them, except if God took them away. They have struggled very hard to stay there and by whatever means. And so we have some, we find there are some old people who would argue how long are they going to be there. More importantly for me, what I would want us to pay attention to, it is how are they governing? If they have made all these efforts to stay there, by all means, we need to look at the scorecard. I think that's what, in the first instance, should guide us. It is not the numbers, it is not who they are or how they are or dynasties, and I'm going to say something on that too, but their performance. Are they performers? To a large extent, many of them have not performed. That should be our beef with them. They have stayed in power for selfish reasons, and they are serving no one except themselves. So they should go, and they shouldn't even be there, because if you are not serving the people, then you have no business being in political leadership, especially. Yeah. As for dynasties, it has only been, I think, 3 maximum. I think actually 2, the dynasties, and except for the top guys who hold those positions, the rest, we don't see much of the rest of their family. So when you say a whole dynasty, He's the one ruling. I think you need to be very careful with that. Um, and I think we need to focus ourselves on the real things that do matter, because those can easily, if we organize ourselves, be dealt with. They are not that many to defeat us. I think it's the very nature of governance that should worry us a great deal, that the governance has remained authoritarian and self-serving and not helping anyone except those there. It is me, myself, and my clan. End of story. Yeah.
We're looking at these younger clusters that were quite well represented in the streets about a year ago. And in many ways, I could see their skepticism towards what have been the traditional institutions of governing society and exercising governance and in a sense the everyday mechanics of keeping a society going. How then should they navigate the fact that in a significant way, a lot of the institutions and the levers of power they need to make a change are within the formal dynamics? How are they supposed to navigate this sense of skepticism towards, if I may say, traditional sort of and formal sort of systems in the society?
I think the Gen Zs, are in their right to not trust the formal institutions, because in their lifetime they have seen nothing come out of those formal institutions, and to look for another space. I think anyone fighting for rights is justified to look for other spaces if the tradition, can I say, the formal spaces that exist have already been closed and rendered out of bounds for the outside. And in this case, the Gen Zs are feeling they are the outsiders. And so I would even congratulate them for finding an alternative space, and it is a commendable space and strategic, because social media, which is really the main space that have been utilized and to a certain extent street protests, is a good way to go, but it cannot be sustainable on its own. It can serve a purpose, at least when you are entering into a struggle and a movement, as the entry point, but it cannot be sustainable and achieve, the goals that they want to achieve on its own. It needs now to, combine, to create a hybrid with other methods of struggle, including some very formal ones. But I know the concern is about the institutions have already been destroyed, they have been polluted. But that's exactly the historical role now of the Gen Zs, to get into those institutions and change them and reform them. They're not to be outsiders, because the real decisions, and I can tell you this from experience, are made on those on the inside who sit on the decision-making tables. What happens in the streets, in the social media, can just end up there. You see how quickly the government has reorganized itself after this initial, of course, they were caught flat-footed. That's why they had to react somehow. But you have seen they have regrouped again and ignored the Gen Zs and the social media, and action is still taking place there. And you recall even the president at one point said something which maybe people didn't notice. He said he cannot negotiate with the homeless people, meaning they don't have a proper base from which they are operating. And so he realized they actually can be ignored, and life goes on. And fundamentally, you see, no change will come unless they now re-strategize, and by that I mean the Gen Zs, in a manner where it's the how of getting and sitting in those decision-making tables and doing what they really want to happen from there. In other words, take on leadership. And let me say this, and it may sound like a cliche, power is never given, it is taken. And so you have to, the only way they can be leaders, because leadership is not something to be taken casually, is to prepare yourself and to arm yourself with those skills required for leadership. And because it does require special skills to lead a whole country, because you are no longer leading yourself. You are actually acting on behalf of others. And, to just say you'll be serving people, how? The how of doing it, we have to approach it with extreme humility that we don't know enough if we've been on the outside. And so there are people who can teach you or mentor you to be able to acquire those skills. And they have the time before 2027 to do that. So I would say that's one of the strategies, to prepare to take on leadership, and not just to operate simply on social media and without any entry point to get into those decision making bodies, and where they are also able, when they are there, to monitor implementation of action. Because as you know, policy can be there in a paper, but if it's not implemented, it is as good as just a piece of paper. And so therefore, I'm saying they need to be a little bit more humble about what they know, and take on the responsibility to improve the knowledge of the institutions they want to be changed, and how as leaders, they will take on that mantle of leadership and make sure that the things they aspire to are actually achieved. Yeah? And one of the areas I would say they need to understand is how people access office constitutionally. Yeah? Certain institutions are necessary. For example, political parties. You need to go through via a political party. They have to ask, since we don't have a political party, are we going to create our own vehicle, a political party, in which to use to access power? Yeah? Because the old guards, who they are concerned about, who are the one holding on to those parties, they are not going to hand over to them. And so there are those nuances where, yes, social media action must continue. It is a very powerful tool for civic education, but on its own, it's not enough.
You've been in research, you've been in academia, you've been in policy, especially in the diplomatic space. In your assessment, what has been, its contribution to the recent sort of political dispensation that we have, especially in terms of the key demands that the civic public, so to speak, are making towards the powers that be? Having been in those sort of three pillars, what is your assessment of their contribution to, should you call it, the struggle for freedom?
That's a good question. It is hard to generalize, but let me talk about my own experience, my own. As you know, my initial home was as a scholar. When I first came out of a graduate school with my PhD, I was coming to teach and to train and to do all that pertains to that degree. And that meant being the best scholar I could be, produce knowledge, share knowledge, and build the capacity of the young who are, coming to university, that they come out of there, able to, to do all that they are also, given to do by the degrees they get. Now, that changed for me with time. I realized that that was a very limited agenda because producing knowledge is good and it's very important. But if you are only producing it for publications or for academic consumption, it cannot be adequate. And so I started veering off by intentionally producing research knowledge that was policy and action oriented. It wasn't very popular at the time. I'm talking about the 1980s, 1990s. Actually, I got punished for a while by the university for that, even being denied promotion because I was being told your publications are not really academic. They are, one person told me, and I'll never forget, that they are pedestrian. So there was resistance at the beginning from, producing knowledge that could go beyond, the ivory towers of the creation of knowledge, which is the university. Knowledge was shared and it was assumed policymakers They'll pick it in one way or the other and do the action part. That was not a job of scholars. Now, like I say, I veered off. And I started intentionally producing that kind of knowledge that links with public policy. Yeah? And then decided that I will get involved also in the struggle because I'm also part of this same society. And what I did is to, use the knowledge I had. Because I was, everybody kept telling me, you are the first woman in this country to have a PhD in political science. I said, that cannot be meant just to do research, especially in a country that has such a dire need of people who understand politics and science of politics. And I started training women leaders about the how of politics. The first batch of the 6 women, if you remember, that won seats in parliament after the 1992 elections were my students. And I can name them, and you can confirm that. People like Charity Gilu, Martha Karua, Niva Mwendwa, the rest of them, you know them. There were 6. And they won elections in their own right because Moi had decided he's not going to nominate any woman to parliament, and he didn't. So those were the only 6 women we had that year who made it to parliament. And I believe very strongly that the knowledge, which was first of all research-based, but then converted in a practical way for that purpose, to build their capacity to become good leaders, helped a great deal. I don't think I would have been able to do what I did that year, preparing manuals, training manuals, being also the trainer of this, if I did not have the research, knowledge that I had gained myself to have the confidence to tell them, if you go this way, you're on the right path and you make it. And so this is what we started seeing coming later, slowly. And now I think I can say with some confidence that there are quite a number of academics who are producing public policy-oriented research, which links very well with our initial purpose as scholars, which is to actually contribute to the production of knowledge, which is evidence-based and can stand up to the test of time in terms of resolving problems.
Yeah, one of the interesting things we are noticing in recent times is there's a lot of reckoning in the society. We see it in the church, we see it in the labor movements, we see it in in the digital platforms, the digital streets, so to speak. And in a sense, these have been the levers of power that sort of the political elite have always used to manufacture consent with, their governing mandate and consent, so to speak. But then we are seeing their capacity to manufacture that consent waning, given the kind of reckoning you're seeing in these institutions and sectors of society. What does that mean for the future of political consensus as one of the key governing models for the country, both for these sectors, but also for the political elites?
If I understand you, you are talking about the declining capacity of governance to sell their ideas and easily get consent, from the people without too much questioning. Yeah. And you're saying that is declining. To some extent, and I'm saying this because we need to be very, very cautious with this, because the old guard are very smart people, and they reinvent themselves very quickly. The old method of, manufacturing consent may have subsided, but if you look carefully, they are finding other ways of ensuring they continue to get consent, not in the old way, but in a new way. Now, take the example of a situation where a leader wants to give the impression that he has a lot of support countrywide. What does he do? He manufactures crowds. he manufactures crowds. They can either be bought, or they can we can use technology to create the image that there are several thousand people here, and people can be told in advance when to say yes during the rally and when to say no. Yeah. So all they would do is echo that. In other words, the business of running, a government, in this kind of space, can also be commercialized to an extent that they continue to get the consent. They continue to manufacture consent. But the difference now is that the way they used to do before is no longer possible because people have gotten smarter. And also, social media has added another dimension where very quickly people can say that's a lie. Yeah? And so they cannot sustain the kind of situation, for example, during our time in the 1980s and 1990s, when people did not have, access to information as they do now, that they could easily just go on the radio, tell us this, because there is no other channel, that's the only information you get. They could actually censor information very quickly. That is no longer possible. Ideally, we would want a situation where they are no longer able to manufacture, consent. But that we need also to work on and not, relax too much and assume that they are no longer there. We need to have a counter strategy. Very quickly, when something like this happens, when you are told, see, we agreed on this, and everybody says yes, that no longer is possible. Very quickly, people can counter that. But right now, we are at that space where, they are still fighting to, in some sectors, to manufacture consent. But my hope is that will continue to decline, because it's one of the ways they have kept people ignorant and also unable to take action on matters that affect their lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking at these Gen Zs, what are the viable pathways for them from protest to policy, if they are going to be able to get into these formal institutions and begin to influence the directions of the country?
I think it's a little bit of what I said before. All we need to do, and I would ask the Gen Zs to do a bit of looking at very recent history of other places on the continent where something like this have happened. And what comes to my mind is the Arab Springs. And because the Arab Springs started very much like the Gen Z movement here, and it was globally a big issue, a big issue in the sense that, in a place, the Arab world, where conservatism and authoritarianism was the end of the order of the day. They managed to wake up a sleeping giant in that region. They organized the youth. They were, basically the youth. They organized, and in a very short time, it is like bushfire. It was all over the Arab world. In Libya, it started off in Tunisia. But I think they need to look at the end story, because in a lot of those countries, this movement was not sustained. And it was not sustainable because they had not planned, the way forward properly, especially how to get themselves in power and be the ones holding the mantle of leadership. That strategy was not worked out. And so they were soon overpowered by all these dictators of various kinds. And it's because they had no option B or option C in terms of moving forward and occupying spaces of leadership. And that's why I said this is a good time here for our Gen Z to not just spend all the time on social media, but to take up civic education a bit more seriously, issues of mentorship, getting into intergenerational dialogue, where they are communicating with older people who have been there, seen that, and there are some very good people. Being old doesn't mean you are a bad person. You may not be a Gen Z, but you share the same views and ideas, but you have the advantage of experience and wisdom by having been there for a very long time. So they can learn one or two things about what to avoid, the traps that, can mislead them, but also learn how to take on leadership. Because leadership comes with heavy, heavy responsibility, I can assure you. And you have to really be prepared because, you'll be attacked by people, you'll be undermined, but you have to stay the course, you have to continue to provide a vision to people who are looking up to you, and you have to deliver what you promise. And so these are not things you just wake up and do, You have to, you need time and it needs preparation. And that cannot be done with only one strategy, social media or a protest. We need to move from that corner. We need to, Gen Zs need to get more involved with people who are doing research, because that's where knowledge is gathered. Either, because many of them are actually students. When they are learning in the formal classroom, they are also preparing themselves for leadership. And they can work with their professors, with their lecturers to prepare themselves to take on leadership, because they are old enough to take on leadership. It's not just to point out to the older guys that you need to do this, you need to do that. They should say, now I want to show you I can do this. From where I'm seated, when you are 18, you are an adult. And I think it is not right for us older people to keep treating them, people who are 21, 22, and so on, calling them our children. But also the Gen Zs themselves have to prove that they really do know they have come of age and they can do this. Yeah. So all I'm saying is, it is not to say that what is being done now in terms of strategy is wrong. It's to say it's not enough and it cannot go very far. Yeah.
Okay, which is interesting because you've mentioned Tunisia and Libya by extension. But then on the other side of the continent, we can see NSAS in Nigeria. We had Fees Must Fall in South Africa. Over the last decade and a half, there's been this youth restlessness towards the governing infrastructure in their respective countries. And it seemed to be a shared anxiety across board. What do you make sense of that? This sense that the youth don't seem to believe in the capacity of the current governance framework to deliver on their dream, whatever that dream is.
But that's exactly the point I'm making. They shouldn't be bystanders, and criticizing from the outside. They should endeavor to get there and, get their hands dirty in the mud and clean up the place. If they're waiting for someone else to do it for them, there is not going to be someone. If the person who is there is not doing it, get there yourself and do it. And that's why I'm saying that prepare yourself to be a leader. And I think this is one of, I can't emphasize this enough. Power is not given, it is taken. And if you have to take it, you better know what you are going to do with it. And also remember, you are not getting there to just be chest thumping. You are carrying a heavy responsibility of other people. So preparation is everything. And I think we need now to see already, as we prepare, how many years? We have 2 years left. I think we need to start seeing a regrouping where among the Gen Zs now they start saying, who among us can lead, so that we support, and we help build their capacity, or look for others who can help us build their capacity. They need to start identifying themselves as to who is going to do the cleaning up. If they are waiting for these same people they are criticizing to do the cleaning up, they are going to get very frustrated, because these people are quite happy with the way the situation is, and it is only those who are unhappy who can come and change it and make it a better place. Because it is, I can tell you, institutions on themselves are not the problem. It is the occupants of those institutions who, in my view, are the problem. So if you're unhappy with the occupants, get them out and get in and prove that you can do better. Yes.
Prof, what's a crystal ball of the future?
You know, I am an optimist. Although I am also critical about the present, and sometimes I get very disappointed and wonder, you know, which way we are headed. But I also have a lot of hope. And one of what gives me hope is that this evolution, which has come as a result of digitization, such as, the information. I know there is all manner of information, some good or worse, but that alone has transformed a lot of things which cannot be reversed. And yes, there are still obstacles on the way, but they can be overcome. Because I know one of the greatest problems and challenges we faced, our generation, was that we had, information was used against us, denial of information. We couldn't even get support from the rest of the world because nobody knows what is exactly going on. Misinformation was everywhere. And I believe that's already, for me, a catalyst for change, which cannot be reversed. It can only get better. And with the time, we will learn how to use it, to harness it, for, in the best way possible, to do some of the things we were not able to do before, including, even raising our own awareness about, how to govern and how to, take on the mantle of leadership and sustain it. It will help us in terms of coming up with more innovations, creating more employment, which is one of the biggest, and hugest problem we have right now. So it may take time because it is not an event, it's a process. But if we sustain, the desire for change and backed up with, this, technological revolution, the future, augurs well for us. I cannot tell you how long it's going to take, but I don't see us being stupid enough to go back where we have come from. We can only get better.
Professor Maria Nzomo, always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.